I remember saying, well, Lord, I've had the first 22 years of my life. If you want one of the years of my life, who am I to complain about that? And God said, oh, you thought the first 22 were yours? We have become reactionary emotional thinkers who respond much more quickly to memes than to essays or articles. If we want to take credit for our successes, we have to logically take credit for our failures.
In this episode of the Wayfaring Stranger podcast, I talked to Dr. Jeff Bjorck, emeritus professor of psychology. In this conversation, we discussed Dr. Bjorck's journey into psychology, his perspective on embracing limitations as God's gifts, and his thoughts on the changing landscape of academia and culture. We explore the concept of self-care as worship and how he balances various interests such as hang gliding, music, and photography. We also delve into his post-retirement reflections on faith, service, and the importance of community in Christian life. May his story of integrating faith, psychology, and his various passions inspire you to embrace your own limitations and find your purpose in serving others. I hope you enjoy this episode. I'm just interested in how you got interested in psychology.
Well, Sully, I was always interested in everything, which is the brighter side of ADHD, which I'm sure that I've had my entire life. And it was particularly challenging as a child because they didn't have the diagnosis. The closest they got was something called minimal brain damage, MDB. And I was instructed to do things like sit on my hands and to try to be still but I was interested in everything. But in the midst of having an interest in everything, I told my parents frustratedly at the age of 6 that I discovered my hobby and that it was collecting hobbies. And I did. I had a stamp collection, a rock collection, a coin collection, a leaf collection. I collected spiders in the wild and brought them so that I could study them in my yard. I collected dust beneath my bed. That was not a good one. But I was just interested in everything. And there was joy in learning. Having said that, I always also had a deep empathy for people. When I was in first grade, the third grade teacher brought her son who had cerebral palsy, who was my age, and he would sit in the first grade class while she taught. There weren't, there wasn't a place for him to be at that point. And I was just naturally drawn to him and asked the teacher if I could sit with him. I was drawn towards those who were hurting or those who were suffering. As I grew and my interest grew and it expanded, very early on, I started drawing at the age of 4, and I did illustration, painting, some writing, all different kinds of things, physical activity. But by the time I was 13, I remember I performed my first piano solo at a concert at school and received a standing ovation. Wow. And I also performed Moonlight Sonata that day, but then I did my own composition, and that's what got the standing ovation. And after the concert, the music teacher said, I want you to meet this gentleman. It was a bespectacled, gray-haired man who said, young man, I want you to keep practicing and playing because I want to see you in 4 or 5 years. And he was a Juilliard professor. And I already knew that there was no way I was going to be a pianist, because it seemed to me it was wonderful. I liked it, but it was very self-absorbed. And I just already had a sense, partly because I already had a live faith and a relationship with the Lord, that I was supposed to be helping people. And at the same time, that I loved science and learning. And so when I applied to college, I had no idea what I was going to do with my life. When I got to college, I said, well, it certainly seems that if I want to help people and I want to study science, you put those two together and it seems like it's psychology. So I jumped into a psychology major. But at Colgate University, where I was a college student, psychology was in the natural sciences division, not the social sciences division. So I studied rats and Y mazes and perception and cognition and learning and research and enjoyed that very much. But all the way along that line was also realizing that even in high school and younger, people were drawn to tell me about their problems, et cetera, and so forth. And so it seemed like a logical direction to be going in. And I've perceived my entire life as a series of forks in the road. And you get there and you ask the Lord, which way should I go? And you talk to wiser, older Christians, and you read the scriptures and you pray and you make your best choice of which fork to go. And I have found that if you make the wrong choice, God doesn't smack you. He says, that's an excellent try, but I actually want you to go this way, and you redirect. And nothing is lost in that time because you grow from it. And so by the time I was getting ready to leave college, I was quite sure that I wanted to be a clinical psychologist. And so that is when I applied for clinical psychology doctoral programs. And I applied to 6 of them and got in nowhere, which I believe was God's hand on my life, because I know that looking back, the year between beginning a doctoral program a year later, that year helped me reassess my life in multiple ways, which I believe helped give me a firmer foundation for when I started my studies.
What were one of those things that God wanted you to reevaluate, do you believe, before you went into that?
Well, we can start with the clinical psychology one, addiction. I had discovered that my drug of choice was coffee, and you may laugh at that, but I worked in a restaurant from 14 to 18, and then the summers too, and by the time I was 18, I stopped one day and counted, and I was drinking 10 or 12 cups of coffee a day. And boy, you can do anything when you drink that much caffeine. And it helps your ADHD. It helps you concentrate. It also makes you kind of obnoxious. By the time I was a senior in college, I had crept back up to 8 or 9 cups and said, if I'm going to go to graduate school where it's harder, I should stop this. So March 20, 1983, I took a jar of instant decaf and a jar of regular and mixed them half and half, and I would have that for emergencies, and I stopped drinking coffee, and it helped many things. But having a year off to have the time to form that discipline so that by the time I got to graduate school, coffee wasn't an issue. And obviously, I think lots of people can have a cup of coffee or 2 cups of coffee a day and they're fine. I was not.
Yeah.
And so that's the physiological, psychological one. Another, I had someone very, very dear to me whose life was careening out of control. And if I had not been home that year, that person might have died. I also had experience with a prison ministry that I never would have had. But the special thing that year gave me, when I sat at home on the couch and watched kids walking to school, and I'd been a student for my whole life, and my advisor, by the way, had said, you're crazy not to think you'll get in, because I had very good credentials. And when I didn't get in, she said, I'm not surprised, it's very competitive. People have a way of rationalizing. But I really believe the Lord pulled me out that year because I did have the credentials to get in. However, I remember saying, well, Lord, I've had the first 22 years of my life. If you want one of the years of my life, who am I to complain about that? Well, my cultural heritage, not my bloodlines, but my cultural heritage is New York Jewish. My father was born in Brooklyn. His parents grew up in Brooklyn. And so when God talks to me, he talks with a bit of a Jewish accent and sometimes just smacks me in the back of the head a little bit. And God said, oh, you thought the first 22 were yours? Because you see, they had followed my script more closely. But that revelation, that understanding that no, my whole life had been God's. My whole life had been my Heavenly Father's. And this year was no different. Gave me an awareness of a deeper level of surrender to the one who made me and knows me best, and gave me a year to practice it. And I said to the Lord, like Gideon, my fleece was, look, I will apply again. If I don't get in a second time, I'm going to take that as evidence that you want me to do something else. And so I also started looking into other career possibilities, like teaching English in Micronesia. And I applied again, got into several places, and so started my graduate education. But the first thing I did when I started my graduate education that fall was go to Urbana and go to the Inter Cristo tables. That was a new organization. I'm not even sure if they're still around, but to see what are the jobs for psychologists who are Christians. And there weren't many. But I figured, well, you're going to use me somehow. And I took those next steps by faith.
Just curious, do you drink coffee now or no?
March 20, 1983. No,
That's it.
that's it. And in fact, on occasion, if I had a really, a rough, like a sleepless night or something like this, I would have a Coke or a cup of tea. And I know that sounds silly, but first of all, tea has a different main ingredient. It's actually not caffeine, it's theophylline, which people use for asthma, and that's why a cup of tea helps you breathe better. Theophylline and caffeine are both methylxanthines, so they're both stimulants. But when I'd have a cup of tea, I didn't feel like I needed another one, and I wouldn't have another one. Just making a very long story short, I've decided in my life to be caffeine free. So that's even a more recent thing. So I'm approaching 3 years with not even a cup of green tea.
Wow. Actually, I did hear a pastor talk about that one time of how it's Christian cocaine. So it's acceptable, but he said if you need it to function, it's not acceptable. And for him, he realized it was making him more irritable and impatient with his family. So wasn't good for him.
Yeah, same for me.
Yeah.
And again, I think many people can have, if you have a cup or two of coffee a day, live long and prosper. I think that's fine. And in fact, there are benefits to it, especially something like green tea. Although some of the things you can get from that, I will drink a decaffeinated green tea, or I will drink a decaffeinated cup of coffee. The interesting thing is most people who really have to have their coffee every day, if you say, could you drink decaf? They say, no, it tastes horrible. It's like,
Yeah, that's
it doesn't
funny.
taste that much different.
Right.
That should tell you something.
Yes. So you're in grad school. You get out of grad school. What's the first thing you do?
Okay. Well, first of all, I was in grad school for back to Our Plans and God's. I was accepted to programs that were 6 years, and most of them were 5-year programs. And I decided to go to a 5-year program and took 6.5 to complete it because that's how God's timing is, not ours. And it was a rich experience. So on my way out of graduate school, the last thing you do is a year of residency. We call it internship. And so I worked at the University of Oklahoma Health Science Center consortium of 9 different hospitals. And I focused in pediatric psychology, veteran psychology, neuropsychology. And when I wrote the application for internship, I said, I know that I want to do practice. That is what I have focused on with my education. I know I probably want to do some popular writing or speaking, but I'm, other than that, still not exactly sure what I'm going to do when I grow up. The only thing I'm really quite sure I wouldn't be is an academic. 18 months later, I was an academic. Because during my internship year, I really felt the Lord speaking to me through a number of different people saying, you should actually try to make a research contribution. Not so much be a teacher, but to be a researcher. And the only place you can really do research quite readily is in an academy. But I wasn't qualified. I had focused all of my, we call them curriculum vitas, but resume on clinical work. And so I thought, well, okay, I will finish my dissertation, get married, because at that point I was getting ready to be married, work in a private practice, and while I do that, try to get a couple publications out of my dissertation, and then maybe get a job at a 4-year Christian teaching college, build up more research, and eventually get into an APA-approved clinical psych program, doctoral program, where I could do research. And it sounded like an audacious and long route in life, but I just really felt like this is what God was calling me to do. So I made that decision in December of 1989. In January of 1990, there was an ad in the APA Monitor for a PhD program on the West Coast looking for someone to integrate their assessment curriculum. And it was Fuller Seminary's Graduate School of Psychology. And I thought to myself, well, they certainly can't have that many applicants because, especially then, the idea of a Christian academic psychologist was very, very rare. And I also think I could do that. So I applied and began working there officially on November 1st, 1990. And when people would ask me, how did you get a job in an APA-approved clinical psych program? I'd say, well, they were desperate.
Yeah.
And they were, because there were hardly any candidates. When I was interviewing, there was no one competing for the slot. I think they got a good deal with the aptitude that the Lord gave me, but it certainly wasn't, on my merits that I got that position. And there began a 30-year career of teaching, because that's what you need to do, doing research and publishing in research journals, and also becoming a licensed clinical psychologist and continuing to do the practice that I loved, but at a very reduced rate, 5 patients a week, but always doing some and enjoying that.
Mm. What does that job look like, I guess? Because I picture my only experience in academia is undergraduate. So in your position, you are lecturing, you are, what kind of classes are you teaching?
So, especially when I first began, Fuller's clinical psych classes were unusually large. So my class, there were 5 people in my class at the University of Delaware. Fuller classes were classes of 40 because they had a PhD program and a PsyD program, and those students took similar classes, and they had higher numbers. I don't think that's ideal, but I think we did a good job of doing the best we could to teach those people. And then there were also smaller classes that were seminars, but they were fewer and further between. I taught a research seminar on faith and coping when I first got there. I taught classes on certain types of assessment instruments. I taught a course in human learning. I had a little research team. And those students working on their master's projects and their dissertations, I was doing one-on-one. But as a result, the vast number of my mediocre number of publications through the years, that's another turn in the road, by the way. I felt like God called me to Fuller to do research. And about 10 years in, I felt like he called me to come to try to do research and build character, but that actually the spiritual and professional formation of those students, especially the spiritual formation, was the main reason I was there. But the students would often say, when they saw what the faculty did there, that we were overworked, and I think that was true. And by the way, that's one of the reasons why I would define my list of publications as mediocre. I had about 40 publications in 30 years. I should have had 150. I had 1 book, few book chapters. I should have had 5 books. Why didn't I? Because your body's the temple of the Holy Spirit, and we're supposed to take care of our temple. And I felt like my students' educations were a higher priority than a list of publications. And so I sacrificed the quantity of research that I did over the years so that I had available time for my students and available time for enough sleep every night, a healthy marriage, and a good spiritual life, and fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you explain, at the beginning of that, you said you were teaching about faith and coping. What is that?
Sure. So actually, my dissertation was one of the first, and the publication that came out of that was in the very early years of the concept of religious coping. The key person in that field was a man named Ken Pargament. He was at Bowling Green in Ohio. We became colleagues and friends over the years. If you go back in the history of psychology, of course, you go back to Freud. Freud clearly thought that all religion was a neurosis and a problem. And that shroud draped over psychology well into the 80s. People then began to realize that, you know what? We just stuck one item on our questionnaire about all kinds of things. How many times do you go to church a week? And it turns out that religious attendance correlated with better emotional health. What's that about? We thought it was a neurosis. And so people started actually using empirical methods to test these things. So what is religious coping? Religious coping is when you use your faith to deal with the stresses in your life. So for example, what if I say, I work together with God to solve my problems? Well, that would be religious coping that is problem-focused. Or I seek ways to figure out how God will use this event for my good. Well, that's a religious reappraisal of the situation that can help you see it in a different light and feel better about it and learn more from it. I ask other people to pray for me. Well, that's like seeking social support, but in a unique way. And so these are ways that people would use their faith to cope. And if you're not a person of faith, you don't have those resources.
Yeah.
But so that's religious coping. And so my dissertation, what I wanted to look at is how do people plan to cope with really severe stressors? And we typically find people reaching out to God more when they're afraid. But why would people ask God for help with threats more than losses when the losses can be more profound? And what I concluded in my discussion was that people would rather ask God to get them out of potential problems than to help them with ones that have already happened.
Yeah, definitely. When you're talking about religious coping in stress responses and different things like that, I've looked back at journals and like, this response that I'm having to a particular event, my prayer or what I'm writing feels a little more learned and overheard than a genuine response to a personal God. Some of my responses seemed more neurotic and not healthy. You know what I'm saying? Trying to make an experience religious as opposed to, like, for instance, let's say I'm irritable, I'm this, I'm that. I can project that as a spiritual warfare, as
Yes.
as a
Yes.
wrestling with my flesh, which are religious concepts, when in fact maybe it's a physical manifestation that I need to take care of. Did you make any distinctions like that in your work?
No, probably not, simply because the best survey, the best experimental research survey is the one that's completed. And when you get at that fine-grained level, it would take hours and no one would finish it. If you want my opinion, based on my life experience, I would say that certainly within the Christian circles that I have walked, people very often will use religious explanations or spiritual explanations for things as a means of externalizing responsibility, as a means of distancing from threat, and as a means of finding other things to blame. If a person says, I'm just really stressed in life right now, and I just feel like I'm under demonic attack because I just never can get anything done. My first spiritual exercise with a person like that would be to say, well, let's sit down. Let's get out a piece of 8.5 by 11 paper. Let's just write Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday across the top, and let's write 24 hours down the side. Now, show me when you go to bed and when you get up. Okay, so show me your sleep and show me your various activities. Before I even start, people are usually surprised that I have a 24-hour schedule. Why didn't the schedule just go from, 6 to midnight, right? Well, because there are 24 hours in the day, they're all important. And in my opinion, one of the most important activities is sleep, and it needs to be scheduled. But in any event, I would have them write down their various obligations. I've done this with friends, with students, with clients, and I'd look at their piece of paper and I'd say, I don't know why you're complaining. What do you mean? Well, I could find an easy 30 hours here that you could use to get all these things done you want to get done. Where? Well, all you have to do is stop eating and sleeping. And they laugh, ha, 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 ha. To which I then say, isn't that what you've been doing? You haven't been getting good nutrition, good solid meals, healthy meals. You haven't been getting exercise. You haven't been getting sleep in any way that you need it. You've been substituting caffeine and electric lights for sleep. And I would go further. I would tell people that, in my opinion, the key to spiritual formation is a physical thing. It's a solid, good night of sleep. Shoot for 8 to 9 hours every night and see how you feel after a month. And why would that be spiritual formation? I would suggest that you go to Galatians 5:22, read the fruits of the Spirit, and try to find one that isn't significantly hindered by fatigue and by overbooking. The other thing that piece of paper does is it shows people, oh, I was scheduling this activity so close to that when the only way I could make both meetings is if I could beam up and beam down. They weren't even including commute times. And so all that I'm under spiritual attack was actually, no, you're under self-abuse. Take care of your temple. Because you know what? The scriptures say that we are to present our bodies as a living sacrifice. Well, what's the most effective living sacrifice? The one that lives the longest. How do you live the longest? By taking care of your temple. I don't mean that there won't be times when we'll have a sleepless night or a hard thing that comes up in our life, but those are supposed to be the exceptions, not the lifestyle. And in our culture, it's very often the lifestyle. We call people the movers and the shakers. Do you know why we call them movers and shakers? They only have about 3 drops of blood in their caffeine stream. Of course, they're shaking.
Yeah.
And they're moving because they can't sit still.
Yeah. I feel like we're in a time where people do more, maybe have more things that they're doing, but are accomplishing less, thinking less, meditating less, resting less than they ever have before. I noticed it in my own life of just like, just because you're doing a lot doesn't mean you're making any progress.
Very well said. And I would add this. I believe we were created to be dependent upon our Creator. He designed us to need outside references. Neurologically, he designed us that way. Do you know that if you walk into a sphere, like the one in Vegas, if you will, but imagine a sphere just a few feet larger than you, and it's white on the entire inside. And so there's no edges, no corners, no anything. There's just a sphere. And just look up at the sphere. Within moments, you will go blind. The reason is because the rods and cones in our eyes need differences. They need edges to make them fire. We need relativistic change to even see, because we were designed by a Creator who says, let me tell you what the truth is. Let me show you the truth. Depend on me. Let me give you a word that you can hide in your heart. And we were designed and created for rest. It's not just litigious. Darrell Johnson, who many years ago was the pastor at Glendale Press, and in his retirement years that he's still very active. But I remember 25 years ago him saying, they're not the 10 thou shalt nots. They're the manufacturer's specification for optimal performance. You don't get the owner's manual to your new Lexus and say, what? I can only use this gas. I have to use that oil. These are such, exclusionary, rigid rules. No, we say, oh, great. This will help me run the best. Well, here's the deal. Try this. The next time you say, I've got to get this assignment done, and I'm going to push through for 8 solid hours. I'm going to have a Twinkie at noon while I'm working, and I'm going to go through for 8 solid hours. Have somebody else sit next to you and time the amount of time you're actually working. Now, on another day, have a similar task and say, I have 8 hours to work on this assignment, except this time I want you to take 2 15-minute breaks and a 30-minute break for lunch, on which you eat something and maybe even go for a walk. And if I were a betting man, would put money on the fact that the person who takes those breaks will accomplish more, because rest refuels us. Rest refuels us, and it helps our mind. Your brain metabolizes 25% of the glucose in your body. It takes a lot of energy. Well, you need to replenish those. And so when God asks us to rest every night and even at other times, it's because it helps us thrive.
Yeah. But it's also like a discipline to rest, because you don't need to rest in a sense, right? Like you said, we have caffeine, we have screens, we have all these things. How do you personally, like with friends, colleagues, whoever you're around, convince them to rest, right? How do you get them to the place where they realize they need it and they see the benefits of that? Because it seems like, for me, I can have a lot to do and be like, you know what? Normally I try to take Sunday as a Sabbath. I'm like, I just have too much to do or something like that. And I know what that sounds like. I know that's ridiculous. But how do you talk to somebody like that?
Okay, well, your first question is, how do I convince them? The answer is, I don't and I can't. How do I talk to them? First of all, that piece of paper is very powerful, because first, when you realize that you've been cutting corners on sleep and food, second of all, when you realize that you're booking way more, the third thing that schedule shows is there are blank spots on it. So that if you actually have a schedule to your life, and I don't mean a militant schedule, there'll be, here's my schedule, I need to change it here, that's fine. But to have some structure, we do better with structure. But you schedule miscellaneous. You schedule goof off time. You schedule recreation, whereby you imitate the Creator by recreating.
Yeah.
Okay? And those are, all of a sudden, self-care becomes a form of worship. But it's still a discipline. Why is it a spiritual discipline? We do spiritual disciplines to combat the parts of ourselves that don't want to work spiritually the way God wants us to work. The parts of ourselves that Adam and Eve listened to when the devil said, you will be God. How much rest does God need? He neither slumbers nor sleeps. How much food does he need? I own the cattle on 1,000 hills. I don't need any of your sacrifices. God doesn't need any of those things. You're not God. And so, for example, what if every night before you go to sleep, you say the prayer, Father, thank you for this opportunity to once again declare that you are God and I am not, as I go off to sleep, where I will be completely oblivious to my heart rate, whether it stops or not, my respirations. I will at various times be completely paralyzed in REM sleep, and you will be watching over me. Years and years and years ago, back when people died at home, a little nursery rhyme prayer was written. I'm sure you might have heard it. Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. Today, people would go, what an awful thing to teach a 5-year-old. Well, it wasn't so awful when the 5-year-old could come downstairs and grandma was dead because people died at home. We have taken death and put it in the back hall of a hospital so we can pretend it doesn't exist. And the bottom line is we need spiritual disciplines because the devil is still whispering in our ear, you don't need rest, you can be like God. You don't need fuel, you can be like God. And the front of our brain knows that's completely illogical, but the back of our brain is a lot less logical and tends to like that language. And so those are some of the things that I might talk about with a friend. But again, the visual of realizing how their schedule is just a disaster can be a helpful thing. And the other thing is to say, could you consider, Sully, if I ever write a book, it would be called Self-Care as Worship. Could you consider self-care as a spiritual discipline? Not, as the church has called it, selfish me time. And people have said absolutely horrible things. One of the expressions that I hate more than any other, you need to learn to waste time with God. God doesn't waste anything. You need to invest time with God and invest time in quiet and rest. That's not a waste.
Yeah. I was going to ask you because you said that you grew up collecting hobbies. So here's my question for you. As somebody who enjoys doing a lot of things, how have you been able to focus when you have to do something? Because you compose and record piano, perform. You were writing academic journals, mentoring students. These are a lot of different things. And then also hang gliding,
Yes.
I'm sure there's a lot of other hobbies you haven't even mentioned that you still do. Actually, I'm curious, what are some other hobbies you do?
Photography. I love gardening and landscaping. Landscaping is a therapist's dream because every plant you look at that has aberrant growth, you make an intervention, there's no resistance, and there's immediate change in growth. It's beautiful.
Yes.
So I enjoy that. I enjoy travel. I actually enjoy looking at some of the collections I had as a child that I stopped simply because I don't have the time to do that. And how do I deal with all of this? How do you find the time for those things? Well, the first answer is I often don't. And if there's one thing that my students at Fuller over the 30 years would remember that I said, it was this: all decisions involve loss, which goes against every part of our human intuition that says you can be as God because you can have everything. And we've built asinine expressions to support the illusion. Have you ever heard of a win-win?
Yes.
A 5th grade math student can tell you, you can't have a win-win without a lose-lose. You can't take a piece of pie out of the pie without having a pie with one less piece in it. It's absurd. When we speak of win-win situations, what we're really speaking of is both people winning something big enough that they're willing to ignore what they're losing, but you're losing something. In fact, all decisions involve loss, and loss always involves grief. And so part of healthy living is being willing to grieve our losses so that we can embrace what we have in front of us. And that goes to the corollary. The first statement is all decisions involve loss. The second is embrace, as in bear hug. Embrace your limits as God's gifts to you. Because we live in an increasingly anxious world. And we are going to only get more anxious the more things we try to do while not embracing our limits. And I'll give you an example. I believe guilt is an unconscious means of maintaining the illusion of control. How? You have a daughter who has a piano recital Tuesday at 3 o'clock in Glendora, California. And you have a son who has a major baseball game Tuesday at 3 o'clock in Glendale, California. And it's weird because whichever of those events you go to, you'll feel guilty about not going to the other one. Why? Because unconsciously, you would rather punish yourself for failing to be God than embrace the sad fact that you can't be everything for your kids. Even Nemo's father was in that camp. He looks into Nemo's eyes and he says, "I promise nothing bad will ever happen to you." When does he say that? Shortly after Nemo's mother was eaten. We try to forget that all decisions involve loss, but if I can embrace the limit, then I go with my daughter and son and I flip a coin. Heads. That means today I can be very glad to go to the piano recital and very sad to miss the baseball game. It also means that the next time I'm going to be very glad to go to the baseball game and very sad to miss the piano recital on the same day. And then look in my children's eyes and say, and isn't it great that God will be at both? And you know what you're doing with those children? You're teaching them that they don't have to be two places at once. It's sad. It's a loss, but it's nothing to be guilty or anxious over. The more you're willing to embrace the sadness in your life, and a lot of it has to do with our limits, the less anxious you will be.
It kind of reminds me of the lack of limitation of space with texting and phone call and email also creates the expectation of availability. So now because the limit is removed, now that we can communicate whenever, you're expected to respond within a certain time frame, which adds a certain amount of stress to unplugging for a little bit, because what if somebody needs me? They're expecting me to be available. My kids, my parents, my whoever. Employer. And I think that creates further anxiety for all people.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right. And I believe that we have a technology addiction. And the thing that drives the addiction is the endorphins released from the illusion that we're infinite. But it also is killing us. And back to the embracing our limits and all decisions involve loss. When I sat in Dr. Archibald Hart's office, who was then the dean of the School of Psychology, who ironically was already talking about sleep as something we needed 35 years ago. And I had brought my fiance, Sharon, with me to this second interview. And she was in the room too. And I looked at him and I said, well, this is all very exciting, but you do need to know, if I accept this job, the first line of my job description is going to say, love my wife. And my message to him was that this job will never be a priority over my marriage. And as you can imagine, that's just the opposite of what happens in many, many, many families. And so with emails and phones and texts, I believe that the more you can reduce that input, the healthier you can be. To that extent, I endured no end of ridicule until less than a year ago, because I still chose to use a flip phone. And I now do have a smartphone. However, it is a prepaid track phone that has virtually no apps on it at all. I use it to communicate. The reason that I got it, there were several advantages. One, my wife was teaching international students who needed WhatsApp groups, and we needed to figure out how to use that. And so we needed to look at a smartphone to do it. Two, I will confess that it is absolutely no fun to have to hit the letter S 4 times to make it appear on your text. But aside from that, people have their smartphones that they're, how many times have you seen a parent looking at their smartphone, pushing the kid on the swing with no interaction? How many times have you seen people leave their phone on all night and get texts and things in the night that's disturbing that sleep that they need? In fact, even Google Android, I don't know about iPhones, but they now have a do not disturb feature to have your phone go off. How many people don't use that? The illusion of being able to do everything with everybody is a problem. And it also causes other problems like impulsivity. I'll just shoot this email out fast. Well, guess what? When email was invented, and I was around I don't know, when it became popularized with CompuServe before. And then there was one called Prodigy. And then they had AOL. So this is going way, way back. But people immediately realized you should not try to have a sensitive emotional conversation through email because there are so many cues you're not picking up and you don't want to get the other person mad. And so we had email etiquette where we tried not to do that in emails. Well, but then came Facebook and MySpace and all the others, and social media blew that apart. And so now we don't just do emails, we do memes and we do everything. And people are screaming at each other and hating each other, impulsively snapping out and lashing out from the illusory protection of their "you can't touch me because I'm on the other side of this invisible phone." And it has caused, in my opinion, a massive breakdown in human empathy, in human relations, to the point where you'll have young people and they're sitting in the same room and they're texting each other, not talking to each other.
Yeah.
I think all of these things are not improvements, to the point where obviously they're technological advances, but a line from an old joke I heard many years ago I think is very apropos. We're dying of improvements. So shut your phone off when you go to sleep.
Yeah.
And also shut your texts off. Shut everything off. Get back to your schedule and say, I'm going to answer texts an hour and a half a day. I'm going to answer email another hour and a half a day. That's 3 hours, right? Well, first of all, when you look and see what's piled up in that time, it probably isn't going to be that long. And second of all, if all you spend on your phone is 6 hours a day, wow, are you ahead of the curve?
Right. Right.
And is someone going to die because they couldn't get your text?
Probably not.
Right.
I wanted to close the loop on what your various hobbies look like within the context of your schedule. Sure. And how you balance focusing on the task at hand with various duties and interests.
Well, I embrace my limits as God's gifts to the best of my ability every day. And since all decisions involve loss, I make a lot of lost decisions and I'm sad about them. So, for example, I've been retired for 4 years and I still haven't resumed drawing, illustration, or painting. I have not drawn a serious illustration since 1984. That's a loss. The reason that I maintained photography was because I could still do visual construction of images, et cetera, and so forth, but much more quickly. And so I was able to keep photography. But I also kept photography by never getting a really good camera, because that takes a lot more time and that gets you to another level. But I've been able to take pictures and enjoy that. But I'd like to resume drawing or painting at some point and see where that takes me. And so hang gliding. I've been hang gliding for over 30 years. However, I've probably had an average of 7 to 10 flights a year, whereas most hang glider pilots fly once a week, because a lot of other things take priority and take precedence. And now I've been able to fly a bit more since I've retired, but not a lot more. And so I do less, and that's sad. I love also, one of my big hobbies, I do weight training. And I did competitive powerlifting a number of years ago. In case there's no video evidence of this particular part of your broadcast, there's not a lot of evidence for that anymore. I still do it, but unfortunately, the older you get, the harder that gets. But the biggest thing is, I have a shoulder injury that goes back many, many, many years. I could just be angry at God for that, or angry at myself, or whatever, or I can be thankful for what I can still do. And I can celebrate more fully what I can do by embracing my limits.
So your various hobbies are things that have their own life cycle to them. Sometimes they come back around. Sometimes, like you say, they just don't. They haven't. You hope they do. But you just have to see where you're at now, what you're able to do. Are those things that you have any sort of discipline towards, in the sense of, I try to do this hobby this often, like piano? I would assume you do that one more often than most of
Mhm.
the others, right?
Sure. So I believe that there are hobbies that you do that require no discipline, like watching a TV show. There are hobbies or interests that you pursue that may not be your career, but I might even just call them avocational, because hobbies, I can sometimes almost make it sound a little bit more trite. They can be really deep interests. I prioritize time for hobbies that I believe help me to accomplish my larger objectives of trying to be available for God and serve in his kingdom and take care of my temple. So, for example, my weight training and physical rehabilitation work and physical therapy and all that type of stuff, I do that regularly, 5 times a week, whether I feel like it or not, because I'm trying to, well, I was told I need a full shoulder replacement in 2009. 15 years later, I still have my own shoulder, but it takes work.
Yes.
And so there's work involved in that. Piano. I grew up in a home where I was never hungry, but we didn't have a lot, and we certainly couldn't afford piano lessons. My mom brought out her books from when she was a kid, tried to teach, didn't realize I had a pretty photographic memory, so I would look at the music, memorize it, look down, didn't learn to sight read. By the time I was 13, realized that I could hear things also, sound them out, and compose my own things. So I put the music away, and because it was probably going to be more popular and feeling liked by other students if you were playing something off the radio and not Beethoven. Because of that, for the next 50 years, I would tell people I have the technical skill of a serious 13-year-old. And one of my goals when I retired was to hire a strict piano teacher and start from scratch. So I did. So part of the reason why I play the piano more is because I'm taking lessons. But I also embrace my limits. Do you know where I started in my lessons? With such classics as Row, Row Your Boat and Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. And now I can actually read music. And it's going painfully more slowly than it would have if I'd started younger, especially because 63-year-old brains don't remember or work as well as 30-year-old brains. So the discipline of I need to do this so many times a day, certainly it doesn't happen with hang gliding. I have often gone 6 months without flying. And if I go 6 or 7 months, then maybe I'll go out to a short training hill and familiarize myself before I launch off a 3,000-foot mountain. But something like piano, if I'm going to continue to go forward, I have to do some of the discipline. And I think that can be good. On the other hand, if it's time for me to practice the piano today and someone calls me in crisis, I remember the prayer I said that morning, whoever you bring across my path, and I may skip my practice that day, because it's less important.
Right.
All decisions involve loss.
Yeah. Right.
By the way, all decisions also involve gain. I don't think I'll ever have to remind anyone of that.
Right.
Which is why I don't say it.
Right.
But of course it's true.
Right. What role do hobbies or other interests have in somebody's psychological health?
I was scanning your podcast and saw you had someone speak about one of my heroes, Eric Liddell. And there's a quote in the movie where his sister, and people who have heard that podcast may know, he was born in China. Parents were missionaries to Chinese folks. He was raised in English boarding schools, became great in his running ability. In the movie, his sister is afraid that he's not going to go back to his true call, which was always to be a missionary, which when he went back to China, it was to be a missionary. And he says to her, he made me to preach, but he made me to run. And when I run, I feel his pleasure.
Yeah.
I feel his pleasure. All of a sudden, a hobby can be worship because it is a catalyst for increased gratitude to your Heavenly Father for giving you the gifts that enable you to feel the creation that He has made you to be. And again, that's not just selfish me time. It's that recreation. My artist biography in most places for my piano work says, my creativity merely imitates the Creator. And I think that's our best work, when we imitate the Creator. So I think that the hobbies can be also part of whatever you do all to the glory of God. And if you're doing all to the glory of God, the hobby is not going to become a little God, ever.
Right. Yeah, I almost think of the way I talk about it is overly identifying with something you do. In other words, if something I do is successful, quote unquote, or not, well received or not, and if you take that personally, that's when I think it starts becoming an idol, because it's completely out of your control how people receive something. I remember one time when I was a kid leading worship at junior high or high school, and being in just a bad place in my head, and I was just like, well, that was terrible. And then someone came up and was like, oh, God really moved through that. And I'm just like, wow, that had nothing to do with me.
Well, one of my other little expressions is God works through us, but glory, hallelujah, he works in spite of us.
Yeah.
And I think that you're saying that once you have this thing become a real key to your identity, that it's more likely to be a little God. I think you're right. And so I have not, for example, thought of myself principally over the years as a clinical psychologist. And I have thought of my work in psychology as I do everything for the Lord, but I've thought of that as my vocation, not even necessarily my passion. I've had other passions. One of my passions through the years was I did, for almost a quarter century, I worked in service to a board of a Christian nonprofit that helped empower local rural people in the hardest places in the world get safe water, sanitation, and hygiene. And I traveled to many of those places, and they were places that you wouldn't go if you got a tourist package, because you were bringing your mosquito net and praying for screens and toilets. But that work, to be able to show the tangible love of God through helping people obtain safe water, sanitation, and hygiene, and recognize that this is because God loves us, that was in many ways more fulfilling, more passionate. But I didn't see myself as a nonprofit guru or anything like that either. I really have conceptualized myself through the years as blessed to be God's child.
Yeah.
And honored to be God's servant. You're getting a crash course in what my students would call Bjorckisms years ago. But here's another one. If we can release our successes with open hands of gratitude, we don't have to clutch our failures. You ever see a tennis pro hit a ball and go, yeah? You know what they do in the locker room when they lose? I'm being metaphorical, but the point is that if we want to take credit for our successes, we have to logically take credit for our failures. But if we release both with a grateful heart to the Lord, because when it comes down to it, most of what happens is outside of our control. Take an exam in school. What goes into how you do on an exam in school? Number one, what's on the test? How much control do you have over that? Zero. Number two, what you remember when you go in and do the test. That's a little trickier, but how much control do you have over that? Zero. You have input control, but you don't have output control, as proved by the fact, have you ever had a thought fly out of your head and it's gone? I just did 10 minutes ago. Have you ever had an answer fly into your head? How did you do that? That's the Holy Spirit too, ultimately. But then we get down to brass tacks, how much you studied for the test. Of course, that is your responsibility, but how much control do you have over that? I'll give you a scenario. I'm in college. I've got a midterm the next day. I have not been able to study at all. I've kept up with the work, but I haven't been able to study at all. But I now have that 8-hour span of time to study, because this is before I learned about breaks. And it's, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and I start studying. And another young man walks into my room and says, hey, I just wanted you to know I'm leaving this school. It just doesn't fit for me. And I said, oh, and I started talking to him. And very quickly it got into things of faith. And I'm going, this is my last opportunity to share the love of God with this person or study for my test. Which should I do? And I'm not saying there was a right answer, but I felt called of God to just work talking with this young man. And we did until late into the night. And I said, Lord, I'm sorry, and I'll do my best, but I'm going to sleep. So I went to sleep. Got up the next morning. I hastily read like one essay in one of the books that things were on. It took me, 10 minutes to read it just to see if it would anchor other thoughts in my head. I walked into the exam. It was a one-question essay on that question, and I got an A on the test. Who should be proud of that? Not me. I'm grateful. I could have studied for 7 days and missed one source, and the test could have been on that one source, and I could have gotten an F. Who should be ashamed of that? Not me. I am thankful for my successes and thankful for my failures because I know that ultimately God is overseeing both of them and will work all things, even the bad, horrible things, doesn't make them good, but he works them together for good.
Mm. Did you notice any changes in your students over the years, whether it be study habits? I'm just fascinated by people who've spent a certain amount of time in something and what they see. Did you notice changes, I would assume, correlating with technology, shorter attention spans, stuff like that?
And culture.
Culture. What were the differences you noticed from when you started to when you ended in the student body?
Mm-hmm. Well, when I started, there were no laptops in the world. When I started, there were no cell phones. Well, there were, but they were this big.
Yeah.
When I started, I believe we were still in what I would think of as a moralistic culture or an immoral culture. It was more of an immoral culture, but it was a culture with morals. So when I look at world history, I see what seems to be a rotation from immoral to moralistic cultures over time. Moralistic cultures usually occur during times of natural disaster or war. Immoral cultures tend to flourish in times of affluence or technology. So just think about the United States. The Victorian era is quite stifling, and you have World War I on top of that, very moralistic cultures. The war is over. We go into the roaring 20s. Our culture was really quite immoral. They didn't have movie rating systems back then. I mean, the first Tarzan of the Apes movie, 1929, I believe, with Johnny Weissmuller and Marina Sullivan, I forget her name, full frontal nudity. And there were no rating systems. So people don't realize it was pretty gnarly back then. But then you have the Great Depression. Boom, moralistic. And we have a moralistic culture that is then accentuated. Boom, World War II. Coming out of World War II, we start to have prosperity, etc. There are the vestiges of religiousness still, but into the 60s, we have the sexual revolution that blossoms into the 70s, continued sexual revolution that blossoms into the, AIDS, the early 80s. And all of a sudden, we have a devastating epidemic, and people are pointing fingers and making absurd blaming comments in various directions, but talking again more about God's judgment and more moral concerns. And as we start to come out of that, we're just about out of it, and boom, September 11. And we have Pray for America, God Bless America bumper stickers on every other car, and it looks like America is the most religious place on earth for about 9 months. And then it slowly starts to get back into a more what I would call an immoral culture, meaning a culture that glorifies hedonism, a culture that says, yeah, we know these things are bad, but if it feels good, do it, and we'll do those things. So that was the culture of the 90s. But into the next millennium, especially 2010 to 2020, even a little bit earlier than that, I would submit that we are now in an amoral culture for perhaps the first time. A culture based on postmodern philosophy that in fact says there are no absolutes, there is no such thing as right and wrong, there are only differences, and you tolerate differences. That's where we get the term tolerance, which is not a biblical concept. Tolerance is based on the assumption that no one can be wrong or right, there are just differences. You want to know a much harder thing to do than to tolerate people? To love them. Agape love says, God has told me that I think some things are right and some things are wrong, and what is happening here is wrong, but I'm going to love you and do my best to serve you as best I can, even though I disagree. That's different. And so not only that, but I believe, again, further away from disasters or military crisis we got, and with the polarization of media and social media booming to the place where I believe decreased our ability for logical thought. We have become reactionary emotional thinkers who respond much more quickly to memes than to essays or articles. We don't think of ideas. And so in our current culture, there is more entitlement. There is more assumption that everyone's truth is their own truth. Now, obviously, not all of that was something that I saw at Fuller Seminary as a Christian seminary, but it would also be ridiculous to assume that even a seminary would not be influenced by the culture outside it. And so I believe that with words like diversity and diversity of ideas and tolerance, I believe there has been an increasing discomfort or avoidance of the fact that the Bible tells us that there is one way to heaven, that there is a God who has the right to say what is right and what is wrong, has designed us for that. And those ideas have become less palatable over time. I also believe that with the idea that every idea is equally good because there's no right and wrong, this can tend to decrease the sense of the academy being a place where you exchange ideas and can disagree and have an intelligent discussion without assuming that if a professor says, I believe that A is true, that they're using a bully pulpit, or that if they question a student who says, I believe B is true, what do you think of C, that they're simply being mean or trying to be threatening. Those types of statements in the 1990s would not have been a problem at all. It would have been academic dialogue and the exchange of ideas.
I wonder if it's becoming amoral or if the morals have simply changed because the aggressiveness to which people seem to exchange ideas, I agree with you, it is definitely reactive. It's mainly devoid of logic and reason. But there does seem to be almost like a fundamentalist scarlet letter attitude towards certain things that makes me think of a moralistic culture.
Well, I think you're right, because I think in an amoral vacuum, when some things can be identified as a scapegoat, all that pent-up moralism can come spewing out. I believe that as soon as you find someone or something to hate, then you can speak very moralistically against them because they are evil. Jon Stewart of The Daily Show, back in the 2010s, I think, he had his fake news team go to the Democratic National Convention. And, you know, Jon Stewart is politically liberal, but he was trying to give a balanced view. And he was basically, it was a satirical piece, but he had his interviewers interview these people at the Democratic National Convention, and he was asking them about tolerance. And who do you tolerate and what do you tolerate? And basically, many of them that they cherry picked for this piece, so it's not fair, it's a humor piece. But what about the evangelical Christians? Oh, no, not them. So in other words, the idea that one would be tolerant of a group that doesn't necessarily advocate tolerance was anathema. And by the way, I believe that some of the negative feelings of those folks at the Democratic National Convention were deserved, because I think that unfortunately, Christianity today has acquired a lot of these sentiments to a place where we are now insisting that the world make us comfortable and act like we think they should act.
Yeah.
And I believe that I just never saw Jesus doing that. I never saw Jesus push anyone. I saw him say, follow me, but I never saw him say, or I'll make you. And I have a pastor friend who years ago said, when Jesus healed a cripple's legs, he didn't say to the cripple, I've healed your legs, and now you need to follow me. And if you don't, you're going to be crippled again. He said, Jesus said to this effect, I've healed your legs that you might know the love of God. Follow me. But if you don't, enjoy your legs. Now, obviously, Jesus never said that in Scripture, but I think that's a scripturally consistent idea.
Yeah. Could that translate to Christians doing acts of service merely for people to get on their side and not out of a genuine heart?
Oh, I don't think anything's ever that simple. But I think that we all have mixed motives and motives that are like our shoes being full of feet that we're not right aware of immediately. So, there's not a single human being with a pure motive. And there's certainly not one of the other absurd statements from secular circles is random acts of kindness and senseless beauty. Dallas Willard in The Divine Conspiracy back in 1998 pointed out, beauty is never senseless. And kindness is not random. It's intentional.
Yeah, definitely. I was wondering if you could help people who are considering doing something counseling or psychology adjacent. How do you feel about that now? And what should somebody who's interested in counseling, MFT, being a psychologist, clinical psychologist, what should they consider from a Christian perspective?
Okay. If I were talking to, let's say, a Christian college student thinking about, I want to get into the helping professions and maybe become a psychologist or a counselor or whatever, what I would say is that it's a worthy calling, a vocational calling. I would also say that I believe it's going to be significantly more difficult for them than it was for me. When I was going through graduate school, the majority of psychiatrists and psychologists were atheists, but psychology was also involved in an increasing amount of empirical research and science. Not only that, psychology was not so focused, the major organizations like the APA were not so focused on trying to influence culture. Nowadays, that is not the case. Nowadays, I believe these associations are working very hard to try to influence culture according to what they see as healthy lifestyles and healthy relationships, whether or not you agree with that. And because they are the scientists, and I certainly believe that science and psychology has in some ways replaced the church and religion in the United States anyway, people look to them for the authoritative answers. And so that includes legislators, and legislators can then say, this is now illegal. You can't talk about that. You can't do this. You can't do that. So all that to say, I would want someone going down that path to realize when I was a graduate student, I had to have my strainer, if you will, that I used to try to strain out what I felt in the curriculum was consistent with Scripture, glorified God, and was useful. And there was a lot. There was also a lot of stuff that wasn't. I believe the amount that doesn't glorify God and is not consistent with Scripture has grown and has also now come to a place where it's impacting laws and telling you what you can and cannot do as a counselor. And so in that way, a person pursuing one of those careers would need to realize you're going to have even more limitations if you seek a licensed route as a mental health professional of some type. Even if you become a licensed pastoral counselor, because most of them are beholden to the local psychological association or whatever. Another alternative might be to get that type of an education and consider being a pastoral counselor for a church, not a licensed one, but someone who has the education and the understanding and the knowledge to help them do the work, but then is not beholden to the legal requirements of various guilds, which are becoming more and more stringent and restrictive.
Mm. In this season that you're in now that you're retired, what do you feel like God has you doing, and what lessons have you learned now that you have some distance from academia and your vocation?
Mm-hmm. Well, I always thought when I retired, it would be because God was giving me a clear sense of what I was supposed to do next. In fact, when I retired, I had folks say, you should do a podcast. You should do a blog. And I said, both of those sound very interesting, and I might very much like to do them, but I am not going to jump into them because another one of my Bjorckisms, if you will, I always want to make sure that I'm following God, not leading him. And so I wanted to take a time to wait and rest and meditate and pray. And 4 years later, I have not had a strong leading to do those things. The surprise was I felt like the Lord said, you've completed this chapter, but the next chapter was, I want you to get up every morning and ask me what you're supposed to do, which was really very, very different than the last 60 years of my life. So I do. I get up in the morning. I have a time of devotional reading, scriptures and prayers. I have lists of people that I pray for ongoing. And then I say, and Father, help me keep my eyes and ears and heart open for who you'd bring across my path today, that I might point them to you and be an encouragement. Help me use my gifts to do that. And then at the end of the day, my wife and I do a little, we call it our thank you journal. It's basically just a Word document with a date and our names each day. And we basically write a couple of sentences about what we thank God for that day. It's a great exercise because it's the upside of the prayer of examine, which I think can sometimes lead people to feel discouraged, like, how did I screw up today? I think there's benefit in both, but I will say we do the gratitude journal. If at the end of the day I can say, well, I encourage that person and I encourage that person, by the end of the year, that's 700 people. And so I've been doing that for 4 years, and I think I could say that I've encouraged at least 2 people a day each day. And some of those have turned into regular visitations with people who are in senior communities that can't get out or are homebound. Many of them are, spur of the moment interactions with someone calls. And quite a few of them have turned out to be people who are in crisis of one type or another. And I've been able to use my psychological expertise and knowledge of coping and things of this nature to give them some helpful advice. It's not like psychotherapy. It's not like a counseling relationship, and pray with them. And I believe that has been meaningful to me. And thankfully, long before I retired, I had already made the shift from thinking God wanted me to be a researcher. And so I had long time ago taken comfort in verses like, in the making of books there is no end, and focused on relationships. And so one of the little expressions that I've used to help me on those days when I kind of feel a little bit like, oh, but I wish I could be doing something more, is that obscurity is underrated. Remember that Jesus told us to do our best work in a closet and in secret. And so there's joy in that.
Mm. Is there anything else that you would like to share that was on your heart before you got here, or that you thought of while you were here?
Sure. That is that, first of all, I believe one of the things that the church absorbed from the world around it incorrectly is the assumption that you're not really a human being unless you're married, and especially unless you have kids. And I believe that the church bought that false premise, and then in order to try to meet it, they created singles groups to try to make that happen, which is fascinating because a singles group is the ultimate oxymoron. A successful singles group disappears. Whereas I believe that, especially in today's world, there should probably be more singles people. We are closer to 1 Corinthians than we've been in a long time. And I do remind people that no matter what kind of a marriage you have, you don't get married to solve your problems. You acquire a second set of problems. Now, if God is calling you two together, like Keith Green said, because you could serve God better together than apart, well, then you'll work together on those two sets, and it will be a good thing and glorify God. But I don't think marriage should be the assumption. I don't think it needs to be the assumption in the church, and I think it's caused a lot of pain. I say that because I've been married for almost 34 years to my best friend, and certainly for the first 10 years or so described ourselves as two single people who happened to be married, because we both had committed to lives of singleness and then decided God was calling us together and realized in a lot of ways we didn't want to lose the freedoms of singleness, but felt like God was calling us to do that. That's all a preface for saying that you're interviewing me today could give the illusion that I'm one of those self-made men. Well, not only am I not, and it's not just God that's helped me, but I count my marriage, I count that pledge I made to Arch Hart, that the first line of my job description was to love my wife, as one of the best things I ever did, because that relationship, she encourages and points me to Jesus. We encourage each other in our faith, and I am infinitely grateful for her influence in my life as someone who very often helps redirect me back to the things that are the most important. And I say that not simply because I, want to make a little tribute for my wife in a podcast. More, I say it because I think a lot of times in interviews like this, people listen to them and walk away without thinking about the fact that they're assuming this person is an individual. And sure, we're individual, but no person is an island, as John Donne said. And I certainly am not. And I also count the influence and support of many dear friends. And it's funny. Protestant Christianity has made a big deal of saying that we're beyond the law. We don't have to deal with the law anymore. However, the New Testament commands us regarding the law, the Christian law. In fact, we are commanded to fulfill the law of Christ in Galatians 6:2, I believe. And how do we do it? Bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. That Christians are supposed to be in community. As my dear friend and colleague Ray Anderson, who's been with the Lord since 2009 now, we taught an integration seminar for 8 years together. He used to say, the image of God is most fully expressed when there are two people, because the Trinity is relationship. That doesn't mean that you're not complete as a single person, but it does mean that no single person or married person is supposed to be in isolation, that we are supposed to be in community. And I say that because we are living in a culture that is continually striving to push us to becoming autonomous, illusory autonomous individuals. And that's not how we were designed. So, yeah, I guess I'd leave you with that.
Jeff, thank you so much.
You're welcome, Sully. It's been a pleasure.